our next presentation is grant writing and fundraising. We have Stephanie Brady from Disaster Leadership Team to talk with us. And Stephanie is the Executive Director of the Community Clinic in Joplin, Missouri. That's a nonprofit organization that serves uninsured residents of Southwest Missouri. She also served as the Vice Chair for the Joplin Long-Term Recovery Committee and the chair of the Unmet Needs Table. I have great respect for Stephanie. Stephanie and I's disasters happened the same year. Joplin was May of 2011, and the Bastrop County wildfires were September of 2011. I have seen the videos of Joplin on the Weather Channel, and I cannot fathom that sort of destruction in my town. The wildfires just destroyed everything. Theirs was a complete mess that they had to clean up, and I don't know how you even start that. To top that off, their recovery also involved getting people out of an emotional state that they were in, because they lost 158 lives in that tornado. Over 1,000 people were injured. A lot of those were children. It was graduation time. I was actually inspired by the Joplin Long-Term Recovery Committee. I watched their Facebook page. When they started building homes, I thought, well, we can probably do this too. We never thought of each other as competing against each other, and I hope to God we weren't competing against each other for volunteers, because we were both very big disasters. So I have great admiration for Stephanie, and she is an extremely wonderful person. We also have Sally Ray here from the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, as well as Chris Henson from the Rebuild Texas Fund. So you're going to kind of get, again, a point-counterpoint. You're going to get an organization's view of trying to write grants, and you're going to get a funder's viewpoint of what they're looking for in grant writing.
All right, thank you, Chris. This is one of the things that I really love talking about, and it's probably not as exciting, but it's extremely necessary. So hopefully the information that you're going to get from me is going to be some of those how to get the funds, because it's necessary. You have to know where to get the money, and you have to know what funders are looking for and how to write the language that the funders are looking for, how to appreciate the funders so that you can continue to get money. So this is something in my nonprofit world I've always valued the need for, but also it really impacted who I was whenever we had our disaster as well. One of the key things that I'll say is you can't, yes, you're competing for funds, but you have to work together. You have to collaborate, you have to share resources, because at the end of the day, you're all trying to get your people home, and the best way you can do that is if you work together. One of the great things that came out of our tornado, out of our disaster, was a group of all of our grant writers coming together in the community, and we still meet so many years after the fact, 7 years after, we still meet on a regular basis, and we still share resources, and we still understand that, yeah, we are competing, but we're also working together. So we really kind of set aside that competition, and we've been able to get more funds because we work collaboratively instead of competing. So just really briefly, the stages of disaster recovery funding. Some of the slides I have here, I want you to have. I may not spend a lot of time on, but it's good information for you to have whenever you look at these presentations, in a few weeks after. Right now you're absorbing a lot, and hopefully some of this information you can trigger something in your mind for later. You've already passed the immediate relief, that right after the disaster, whenever everybody's coming together and they're trying to figure out what are you going to need, and it's chaos. Kind of a funny story, we were contacted, my organization was contacted in Joplin by a really large bank. I always like to kind of tell this story because it puts into perspective what some of the people that you're dealing with right after a disaster happens. We were contacted by a really, really large bank in New York who said, we want to really help you. I was working for a disability organization at the time. Tell us what you need. And at the time, they wanted to give items. They didn't want to give cash. And I said, okay, at the time, what we were really needing were toiletries. We were needing, that type of things for the people that we were serving. And we sent them a list, and they said, okay, we are going to take care of you. And 3 weeks went by, I forgot about the call. And then I got a package in the mail that had the price they had paid to ship the package was $35. Inside the package was about 5 or 6 deodorant, packages of deodorant, some the Girl Scout cookies that were the freebies if you bought a certain number of Girl Scout cookies kind of thing, and just things that we didn't really need. And I thought, that $35 that it cost you to ship that would probably have been more impactful to us. So it's always, we always try to spell out what we need, but even when you spell it out, sometimes the donor or the funder doesn't get it. Short-term recovery, that's whenever the public attention starts to wane. As Jeff was mentioning, that's when the critical recovery work begins, and whenever you really are really starting to need that funding because you've finally figured out what you need, or you're getting to that point. The disaster relief foundations and government funding tends to provide that assistance during that time. That's when FEMA comes in and SEMA in different places. And now you're at that long-term rebuilding. Whenever those funders are really going to pay that key part, and you really have to know what you need and have to be able to tell that story. I say that in Joplin, we kind of had it easy because it was obvious. I mean, our community was destroyed. We lost over a third of everything in our community, our infrastructure, our medical facilities, our schools, everything. But it's easy for a funder to come to our community and see this is devastation. The first time I came to Southeast Texas, everything looks okay. It's everything inside that's not. So it's harder for those volunteers, it's harder for those funders to really see that need whenever the media shows all of these houses and these buildings and these structures that still look okay from the outside. Financial stewardship of funds. So what I'm going to kind of talk about are the nitty-gritty of what you have to do. As a nonprofit, and a lot of you are new to the nonprofit world or new to the committee type of realm, you have to be a good financial steward of funds. And this is a real key part to getting money and then keeping money long term. Donors, you have to think about donors as making an investment in your organization. And they're only going to do that if they think that you are a good fit and if they think that you are a good return on their investment. So if you're asking for money, you have to be able to show that you're going to spend that money well and that you're going to do it based on what their interests are. You must be able to demonstrate your financial stability in order to gain funds. That's not saying that you have to have a lot of money in the bank because you're all small and you're all new, but you have to be able to say that you have good accounting methods, that you're tracking the money, that you're using some sort of QuickBooks or Excel spreadsheet or something that is showing that you are financially stable and that you are able to track where that money's going. They're not going to give you money and then just say, do with it whatever you want without any kind of tracking. They want to be able to see where that money is going. So ensuring that you have good accounting methods to verify where you spend that money. That's especially important for large foundations. Some of the smaller community foundations don't expect as much reporting, but those larger ones are really going to expect documentation to show how did you spend the money that we provided to you. And that's really can be difficult whenever you are a bunch of volunteers working to provide a service, but you have to have some of those methods set up. And those are some of the best practices that we've got on our website that you can see. How are you tracking money that's spent out for disaster case management? How are you tracking money that's spent for buying construction materials? All of those types of things. There's some really good forms and resources on our website for that. So where to find grants? Start by searching large donor sites. These are two that I use a lot, foundationcenter.org and grantspace.org. You can also get on listservs that will send you specific grants and the information that's available on, you can get on a listserv for disaster grants. Disaster.gov is another one that you can actually get on their listserv, and they will send you specific government grants that are for disaster related. You can search foundations that fund in your geographic area. You can search for type of programs, and then you can also join fee-for-service online grant search engines like GrantStation, Grant Watch, Nonprofit Connect, Foundation Center. What I would recommend, what I tend to do is a Foundation Center is a really great one, but it's expensive. And if you have a couple of you want to go in together and share that expense, it can be a really benefit because you might get some large grants from that and you might pay $500 up front for it. So it's one of those things that if you can pool your resources together and share that expense, it can be a benefit for you. So once you find a grant that you want to apply for, what do? Once you find it, you need to determine what kind of money that they give. And most funders who are giving for disaster related are going to be giving for staffing, maybe for disaster case management, or for construction related costs, for rebuilding, for purchasing items for homes. Disaster funding tends to be very specific. It tends to be something that they tell you up front, this is exactly what we want to fund and how we're going to fund it. But you want to make sure that the kind of funding that they're offering is the kind of funding you need. If you really need funding to hire an executive director, that's the kind of funding you need to look for. If you really are needing funding to pay for construction materials, that's the type of funding that you need to look for. Then read the fine print to make sure that you're still eligible. Some foundations only want to give in a certain region. Some foundations might only give to school districts. So make sure that you're reading that fine print before you spend the time to write a grant application to make sure that you're actually a good fit. Grants that make your final cut, and this is kind of if you have, if you're actually working long term, but put those on a calendar. It might be something that their application, you find a grant that their application is due in 6 months from now, and you don't necessarily have the time to work on it right now. Put that on your calendar so that you don't forget about it, you get it on your calendar and you get it ready whenever it's time. And I'll give you some tools here in a moment that take a lot of that legwork out, where you can just have everything ready to go and you can cut and paste and get it into a grant application to make it to where you're able to apply for funds on a quick basis. One thing that I really encourage people to do, and a lot of people are afraid to do this early on, is communicate with the funder. And this is one of the things I think that Sally especially will be telling you a little bit about is, don't be afraid to call them up and say, hey, this is what I'm wanting to apply for. Is this something that you guys are interested in funding? Or, hey, I'm going to put in an application. I want you to know my name. I want you to know who I am so that when that application comes across your desk, you know who it's from. Having that contact, I believe, and I could be wrong, but I have this idea that foundations kind of have like a little checklist in their mind, and all of these different things that they're saying, okay, they contacted me. They have two equally deserving organizations who have an application come across their desk, and they only have funds to fund one of them. And one of those individuals have made that personal contact and have built that relationship and have talked to them, and the other one they've never had any kind of communication with, and they've never reached out to them, and they've never tried to build that relationship. The one that's going to get funded is the one that's built that relationship. So it's not, don't ever be afraid to pick up the phone or to send an email and develop that. So relationship building, people give to people. And it can be true even at the foundation level. People give to people. They know who you are. They have a personal connection with you. And even though they might try to keep that, not necessarily play favorites, but you've got a relationship with them. Get them to know the staff at the foundation. Don't waste their time though. Do your homework. And be ready with talking points in case they call you and want to ask you information about your application. Because they may call you, especially at a disaster recovery level. They realize that you're all volunteers for the most part. They realize that you might not be savvy grant writers. And they may call you up and say, hey, some things were missing from your application. Can you help me understand this better? Can you help me understand what your outcomes that you're planning to develop, or how you're going to get to those outcomes? So making sure that you're prepared anytime you have a communication with them is really important. Be prepared for site visits as well. I always tell any funder that I have, please come visit us. Come see the people who you're impacting. Come visit one of our work sites. Come see how you're impacting our community. Make sure that they know that they are welcome. Even though they're giving you money and they know that they're welcome, make sure that you're extending that to them as well. And always follow up with them and keep in touch. I very rarely have I ever had a funder who says, we don't want any communication. And when that happens, though, respect that. If you have a funder who said, we don't want any press about what we're doing, we don't want anybody to know that we've given you money, we don't want you to call us, it's rare, but when that does happen, respect that. Okay, following the application. So in addition to writing grants, I also review grants. And I'll tell you the quickest thing for me to not fund or not approve a grant is whenever a fund or an applicant doesn't follow the application. It's a huge pet peeve. It could be the best project out there. But if they haven't followed the application and they haven't proofread it, I can't get past it. And you've got to be thinking about that whenever you're submitting that application. So answer each question in the order they're asked. It's a lot easier for the most part anymore because most applications are online, so it takes a lot of that guesswork out of it. But some small community foundations might still have paper applications, or they might have something that you have to print out and submit. So make sure that any time that you're applying, make sure that you're answering those questions in the order that they're asked. Think about that grant reviewer as somebody who's gone through 30 grant applications already. They're tired, their eyes are getting crossed, and if they're having to go through and find things in your application, then you don't want them to have to work whenever they're reviewing your application. Whenever I first started as a grant writer, I thought I was this wonderful writer, and I was telling these amazing stories, and I was very, it was all of this. It was too much information, and nobody could find the answers. It sounded kind of pretty, but it didn't work for the funders because they had to look for the answers. Don't make it hard for them. Watch word counts and character counts. Most of the online applications will truncate, so as soon as you get to a certain number of character counts, it will block off everything after. It might show on there, and it may look like it's there, but it's not. So your best words might be those last 2 sentences, but they're not even there. So make sure that you're watching those character counts and word counts. Foundations don't want extra materials to have to go through. If they say that you can submit extra materials, great. But read what kinds of materials they will allow you to submit. They don't want you to send them a box of all of the pictures that you've taken over the last 5 years of every home that you've ever impacted. Though that's too much stuff for them to have to deal with. They will typically review your website and your social media, so if there's something that you really want them to know, make sure that it's right there on the front page of your website so that it's easy for them to find. Make sure if you want them to know about all of the wonderful testimonials that your residents are saying about you, put them on your Facebook page and make sure that they're tagged to the top. Those are the things that they're going to check, and that they'll be able to see some of that extra materials that you might want to give them. If the application doesn't have one, create your own checklist to ensure you include everything. Some foundations will call you and say, hey, you forgot something. Most will not. Most will say they didn't submit these 2 items, they're not eligible for funding. And that will be it. So make sure you're spending several hours on this application. Don't make the error of not submitting everything that you're supposed to. And I've got some examples of checklists here in a moment as well, and I think that we'll have them on the website also. I'm a big checklist person, making sure that we are submitting everything that we need to. Okay, the language of grant writing. Again, whenever I started as a grant writer, I thought I was a really awesome writer. Nobody wants jargon. Nobody wants overly flowery language. They want facts and information. You have to tell your story in a compelling way, but factual and succinct. Don't make it 10 pages if you can tell the same compassionate story in 1 or 2 pages, okay? Support with statistics. Most foundations want to know numbers. They want to know how many of your residents were impacted. What amount of money is it impacting your community because they're not living there? How is your economy changing? How is the face of your community changing because of this disaster? They want to know numbers. And if you can't give them actual numbers of here's where we are today, it's hard for them to be able to show outcomes of what their money did 2 years from now. So if they don't have a starting point of here's where we are today and here's how your money is going to help us get to tomorrow, that's what they want to see for the most part. Don't use long-winded sentences. Incorporate buzzwords. I like to look at their websites and see what some of their buzzwords are. And if they're regularly using words like empower, then that's probably something that's important to them. Use some of their buzzwords, and it will kind of help put you in their mind whenever they're reading it, that there's a connection. Be persuasive. And the biggest thing is proofread. I have 2 people who they will be as brutally honest with me as possible. And I will give them my application and a red pen and say, be as brutally honest as possible. I don't want somebody reviewing my applications who cares about making me happy or who doesn't want to hurt my feelings. I want somebody who cares about my community and wants to make sure that we have the best application possible so that whenever it gets to that foundation's desk, we're going to get that money. About 85% of any grant applications that I apply for, we get. Because we only apply for money that we think we're going to get. We only apply for money that fits with our program and we fit with theirs. And we have somebody who really reviews it carefully. I also give whoever's reviewing the application questions and say, do I answer this question effectively? Are the words that I'm using conveying what I need to about our community so that this funder will give me the money? Developing grant budgets. Everybody loves grant budgets, but it's important. Making sure that the budget requirements for your project will fit the application, okay? Know your limits. Whenever you're reading that grant application, read those guidelines for what allowable expenses they offer. Because if you apply for something that they've spelled out, this is one of the great things about funders. They spell out, for the most part, exactly what they're wanting, exactly what they'll fund, and exactly how you apply for it. So they're telling you up front exactly what they'll do. So make sure that you're applying for things that are what they'll do. So if they say you have to have matching funds, make sure that you have matching funds. If they have a maximum and a minimum funding amount, learn about that ahead of time. I was working with a person once before who they said, we don't understand why we didn't get this grant. It was a great application. And this was a community foundation that I knew their maximum grant was $10,000, their minimum was $500, and they never went above $10,000. And it's spelled out on their website everywhere. This is how much we fund. And this was a group who did really great work. They applied first year out for $35,000. And they didn't understand why they didn't get it. And I explained to them, you can't apply for something that is outside of their realm. And they said, well, but that's how much we needed. Well, I understand that, but that's not what this funder, it's not a good fit for you. Or you needed to apply for less money and get additional money elsewhere. So it's kind of almost offensive to that funder, if they're, especially whenever they spell it out, how much they fund whenever you apply for something that's outside. It's, again, not doing your homework. So make sure that you do that. Make sure that what you're wanting to do is within what their grant budget period is. If they say this grant can be a 2-year grant, and you say, well, no, I actually want to apply for a 5-year grant, well, that's not something that they do. If you need to be able to apply for funds within what their grant periods are. Not to mean that you can't reapply for an additional grant later on, or not to mean that you can't look at other grants to supplement what you need. And then make sure that you're looking at excluded or limited costs. If they say, we fund muck and gut, but we don't fund rebuilding, or maybe they will fund kitchen appliances, but they won't fund a bedroom appliance, bedroom suits, that type of thing. I mean, weird little things, but some funders will have real specific things. I worked with one time that we could use anything with their money, but we couldn't buy any food with it. So you have to be thinking about that when you're developing your budget. What do they allow and what do they not allow? And don't put anything on there on your budget that they're going to pay for that they don't allow. I always review previously funded applications to really kind of get an idea of what they fund, how much they fund, what they like doing, and that type of thing. It really helps whenever you're doing your application. And then request a reasonable amount of money to fund the proposed project. Funders are savvy. If you apply for $50,000 and it's really obvious that you only need $20,000, then they're probably not going to fund you. Or they are going to fund you much less. But if you're applying for something that's way outside of what you need, then they're going to notice that. But at the same time, don't apply for too little. Don't be overly modest and say, well, we could probably get by with $5,000 whenever you really need $20,000, and they have the capacity to do that. So apply for what's reasonable to do the project. Real briefly, statistics. They really are the heart of your case for support. They support your application using community data. And I know, especially with disaster, sometimes it's hard to have accurate current information. But as much as possible, working with FEMA, working with the county governments, working with different entities. We did a lot after Joplin tornado of surveying. And so a lot of our data was community surveys. We used volunteers to go around and survey our people and find out what are your unmet needs still today? What are you needing? How do we help? So using as much data of the statistics and data that you can is helpful. Funders know after a disaster that your information isn't going to be 100% accurate because it is fluid and it changes from day to day, and you might have lost 20% of your population overnight, and all of the statistics might be out the window, but being able to give them as much information as possible is helpful. Statistics also give you like that baseline, a jumping off point, and always reference your statistics to add validity. I'm a resource fanatic, and so these are just some of the areas where I regularly get statistics. So just some information for you to access. Okay, grant reporting and monitoring. This is one of the biggest parts, I think, for a disaster recovery because you're just in the midst of all of the stuff that you're having to deal with, and your main focus is helping your people get home. Your main focus is making your community get back to some sense of normalcy. And you're not so much worried about tracking everything. But it's imperative that you track as much as possible because that funders, they will want that information. They want to see the outcomes. They have to report back to their funders that the work you're doing is impacting the community and that they're not just giving money out randomly. So you do have to track this stuff. Whenever you're working with disaster case management, that helps a lot because a lot of the funding, a lot of what they're doing is funded by long-term recovery. So you're able to track some of that through there. But having a good system of tracking is important. So keeping those good organized records, make sure you're doing what you said you were going to do. If you got $100,000 from a foundation to buy construction materials and you decided, well, we don't really need the construction materials so much, we're going to buy household items, you better go to that funder first and make sure that that's an approved thing and then have some sort of an addendum to your application. Because if you buy something that you did not plan on and it wasn't in that application, they can't ask for that money back. So it is a contractual obligation essentially that you know, typically with a large foundation, you're signing off saying, this is what I'm going to do for this money. So making sure that you have that communication open, that if you do need to make a change, that you're communicating that with the funder. Tracking the outcomes and reporting them, including information on obstacles and lessons learned. Funders want to know this. What worked well, what didn't work? How can we improve in the future? How can we help other communities? That's one of the biggest things I think funders look to is, how can we take what you did and replicate it in other communities to improve? That's part of the reason why Renee and I and all these other people are here today. We had experiences, we're taking those experiences and we're hoping to share them with you to have a better improvement for tomorrow. Funders want the same thing. Submit reports on time and be prepared for monitoring visits. Briefly maintaining contact outside of reporting. I always send a thank you letter immediately after. Developing that relationship again, making sure that that funder feels like they're important. I always say, probably sounds bad to our foundations in the town, or in the room, but I always say I kind of feel like our foundation or our grant coordinators are sitting in some sort of office all by themselves and don't have a lot of communication, because I feel like they don't get to come out as much. And so, not say anything about the individuals here, but I always want them to feel important. And I always want them to feel like we care about you as much as they care about us. So call them up, tell them how much you appreciate them, send them thank yous. Invite them to come to your facility or to your community at least once a year, and even if they say no, that's not a big deal. They'll probably, say, hey, I appreciate it, but they at least want to have that offer extended to them. Post on the website and Facebook, showcasing their support. One other thing is think outside the box, like the wonderful thing that Nina and her team did for Jeff. One of the things that we did in Joplin for all of our funders at the agency I worked with is we did Shutterfly books for anybody who donated more than $1,000 to the agency I worked with. And it was really easy and it was cheap. I think we paid $12 a book. And it was this really nice little Shutterfly book that we printed, and it had pictures of people who were coming to our community and pictures of how things were impacted. It had some kind of little synopsises of some of the bigger funders of what they did specifically. And then we had every single staff person sign them, so we had a little signing party, and we gave out about 150 of those books. And I had Missouri Foundation for Health, which was one of our bigger funders, called me up and said, this is the best thank you that she had seen. And she kept it on her desk and she shared it with other people. It was very easy for us. It didn't take a lot of time and it was inexpensive, but it was very impactful for them. And she showed that around to people. So think outside the box of how you can appreciate funders. I've already talked a little bit about the reviewing the application, really being critical. Here's some disaster funding examples. So some places where you can get some specific funding. I could talk about grants and funding for a long time. And those of you who know me, I really like to talk. But these are some things that, one of the things that we want to give to you is, even though in 30 minutes or 40 minutes I can't give you everything, I can give you a lot of resources after the fact. So if there's something real specific that you're like, where do you find funding for X? Or how do I communicate this to a funder? Email me, and those are the ways that I can also continue to give you resources and information. Home Depot Foundation was a huge one for Joplin. Home Depot was a hero of mine. They were destroyed, and within 2 days they had a makeshift tent store set up. Of course, I'm sure it benefited them because they were able to sell things continually. But they also contributed hugely to our long-term recovery committee. But all of these are specific ones that have a heart for disaster recovery. These are just some general funding resources, some places where you can go to find grants. And then government grants. I really won't spend much time on this, but there's the pros of government grants are you can get a lot of money for a lot of times multiple years. We got like a CDC grant, Centers for Disease Control grant in Joplin. It was great, but the application process and the reporting can be daunting. So there's some pros and cons. You can get a lot of money, but the time spent in getting that money and the time spent in reporting out can sometimes make it not worth it. So that's kind of my little 2 cents on that. And then general grant tips and resources for government grants. Again, this is all on the PowerPoint that you'll be able to get on our website.